There are few names in Hollywood history that command the same respect as Paul Newman. With his piercing blue eyes, effortless charm, and quiet humility, Newman was everything a movie star was supposed to be. And yet, he never let fame define him. Behind the camera's glow, he was a man of principle, someone who stood for integrity in an industry built on illusion. But even a legend like Newman had his limits. And over the years, he came face to face with people whose darkness went far beyond the characters they played on screen. In a world where the line between performance and reality often blurred, Newman saw the truth up close. He once confided to close friends and interviewers that Hollywood's golden age wasn't all glitz and glamour. It was also a place where power, ego, and envy could turn the most beloved stars into ruthless competitors. To Newman, the real measure of an actor wasn't just their talent, but their humanity. And when that humanity vanished, something far more sinister took its place. While he rarely named names publicly, stories from the sets, memoirs, and private conversations reveal a side of Hollywood that most fans never see. These weren't just difficult co-stars. They were individuals whose behavior, ambition, and manipulation left scars on everyone around them. Paul Newman had worked with the best and survived the worst. And though he carried himself with grace, those who knew him well say he never forgot the ones who embodied the darker side of fame. Today, we take a look back at the actors Newman himself once described as the most dangerous and destructive personalities of old Hollywood. The ones whose charm masked something far more troubling beneath the surface. Because, in Hollywood's golden light, even the brightest stars can cast the darkest shadows. In the early 1950s, when Paul Newman first arrived in Hollywood, he was the image of idealism, a classically trained actor from Yale Drama School, full of hope and belief that talent and integrity would always win. Hollywood, to him, was a dream factory. A place where art and storytelling could inspire millions. But it didn't take long before that dream began to crack. The studios were still run by old power players, men who treated actors like property and expected obedience at every turn. Newman quickly learned that beneath the glimmering lights of the red carpet was a ruthless world, ruled not by art, but by ego. And within that world, he began to notice something chilling. Some of Hollywood's biggest stars, adored by millions, carried a darkness that went far beyond arrogance. One of Newman's earliest lessons came on a film set, where he was the newcomer, surrounded by veteran actors of the golden age. The cameras stopped rolling, and the smiles faded. Suddenly, he saw how some of these so-called legends treated their co-stars, assistants, and even fans with cruelty. The charm that made them beloved on screen was a performance in itself. Newman was disgusted by the hypocrisy, the way fame had stripped away their empathy. In interviews later in his life, Newman reflected on that realization. "Hollywood doesn't corrupt everyone," he said quietly, "but it tempts everyone." He had seen how the constant need for validation could twist good people into something unrecognizable. The more power they gained, the less human they became. For Newman, integrity mattered more than fame. He refused to play the Hollywood game of manipulation and gossip. But standing apart came with a cost. He saw his name whispered about by those who felt threatened by his authenticity. Still, Newman stood firm, refusing to let his moral compass waver. There was one particular veteran actor whose charm had captivated the public for decades. A man with a reputation for sophistication and kindness. Yet, off-screen, Newman saw the mask slip. Behind closed doors, that same actor was notorious for cruelty, belittling crew members, and exploiting others for personal gain. The contrast between the man's public persona and private behavior left Newman deeply disturbed. It was a revelation that would stay with him for the rest of his career. From that moment, Newman began to look at Hollywood differently. The glitter didn't dazzle him anymore. Instead, he looked for authenticity in a sea of pretenders. He learned to spot the signs, the false smiles, the calculated gestures, the hunger for attention that consumed so many. He wasn't bitter. He was heartbroken. To Newman, acting was supposed to be about truth, empathy, and connection. But too often, he found himself surrounded by people who used the craft as a weapon, manipulating emotions not for art, but for control. As the years passed and his fame grew, Newman would quietly confide in friends about the darkness behind the curtain. He wasn't talking about scandals. He was talking about people. People who thrived on others' misery, who treated colleagues like stepping stones, and who destroyed careers with a single whisper. Still, Newman believed there were good souls in Hollywood, rare but real. He gravitated toward those who shared his values: humility, respect, and compassion. It was with these few trusted friends that he occasionally opened up about the 6 stars who had, in his words, lost their humanity in the pursuit of immortality. He never said it with hatred, only sadness, because Newman understood something most never would. The price of stardom wasn't just loneliness or scandal. Sometimes it was the slow decay of the soul. Hollywood's golden age was beautiful, yes, but as Paul Newman learned firsthand, even gold can tarnish. By the mid-1960s, Paul Newman was no longer a wide-eyed newcomer. He was a star. But with success came a clearer view of how Hollywood truly worked. Fame had opened doors for him, but it had also given him a front-row seat to the industry's most toxic behaviors. What he saw behind those doors changed his perspective forever. Newman had grown up with a strong sense of ethics. He'd served in the Navy during World War II, worked hard for every role, and believed deeply in treating people with dignity. But many around him didn't share those values. Hollywood in that era was a world where image was everything, and compassion was often the first casualty. There were actors whose smiles could melt the screen, but whose words could cut like knives. Newman encountered them often. Charming, magnetic individuals who used their charisma like a weapon. They could make anyone feel small if it gave them a sense of power. Some of them had won Oscars and were adored by millions. Yet Newman saw what the cameras never captured: the quiet humiliation of co-stars, the manipulation of directors, the fear that rippled through sets where egos ruled. One night, after a tense film shoot, Newman sat with a close friend at a quiet bar in Los Angeles. He was exhausted, not from acting, but from the energy it took to navigate a world so full of deceit. He sipped his drink and said, "You know, it's not the business that's evil. It's what the business does to weak souls." He'd seen talented people consumed by jealousy, bitterness, and the need to be remembered as the greatest. It was, in his words, a sickness that fame feeds. The turning point came during a major studio production in the late 60s, when Newman worked alongside one of the industry's biggest names, a man celebrated as a hero on screen, but who ruled his sets like a dictator. The actor demanded constant praise, berated younger performers, and rewrote lines to make himself look superior. Crew members walked on eggshells, afraid of being fired over the smallest mistake. Newman watched in silence at first, but one afternoon, he couldn't take it anymore. When the star insulted a young extra to the point of tears, Newman stepped in. "Calm but firm," he told him. "You don't make yourself taller by cutting others down." The set fell silent. From that day forward, the two men never spoke again. But word spread quickly that Paul Newman wasn't afraid to stand up to power. That moment defined him in the eyes of many. Not just as an actor, but as a man of integrity. Hollywood insiders began to respect him differently. He didn't play the gossip games, didn't attend the power dinners, and didn't pretend to like people he didn't trust. To some, that made him an outsider. To others, it made him legendary. Over time, Newman began to quietly categorize the stars he worked with. There were the craftsmen, people who loved acting for what it was. And then there were the performers, those who only cared about fame, money, and control. It was this second group that troubled him deeply. These were the dark souls he spoke of, not evil in the supernatural sense, but consumed by ambition to the point of cruelty. He saw their faces at award shows, smiling for cameras while whispering lies to destroy rivals. He saw them in studios, playing innocent while taking credit for others' work. And what disturbed him most was that many of these people were celebrated, even worshipped, by the public. In interviews, Newman would never expose anyone by name, but he hinted at them often. Actors who treat kindness as weakness, as he called them. They were reminders that fame could be both a gift and a curse. For Newman, Hollywood wasn't just a place of dreams, it was a test of character. And he learned, painfully, that some of the brightest stars in the sky shone only because they burned others to stay lit. As Paul Newman's career reached its peak in the 1970s, his reputation had become untouchable, not just as a brilliant actor, but as one of the few men in Hollywood who refused to lose his soul to the system. He wasn't loud about it, but those who knew him well said he carried a quiet list in his mind. A list of the 6 types of people who, to him, represented everything wrong with the industry he loved. Newman never wrote their names down, but when he spoke about them privately, he described them not as individuals, but as archetypes, patterns of behavior he'd seen again and again among Hollywood's elite. Each one, he said, embodied a different kind of darkness, the kind that fame breeds when conscience fades. The first, he called the charmer. This was the kind of actor everyone loved at first. Witty, magnetic, always the center of attention. But behind that effortless charm lay manipulation. These people used affection as a tool, winning others' trust only to exploit it later. Newman said this type was the most dangerous because they hurt people without ever raising their voice. Then there was the tyrant. These were the stars who believed that the world revolved around them. They ruled their sets like kingdoms, and everyone else, co-stars, crew, even directors, existed only to serve them. Newman had worked with several like this. He once said that the tyrant feeds off fear like oxygen. The third he called the phantom. This was the performer who wore a perfect mask, adored by the press, respected by peers, yet completely hollow inside. They lived in public perfection, but suffered in private rot. To Newman, this type represented Hollywood's greatest illusion. People who looked like heroes, but lived like strangers to their own hearts. The fourth, the betrayer, was a type Newman despised most of all. These were the ones who pretended to be friends, allies, or mentors, only to turn on others the moment it benefited them. He had seen rising actors sabotaged by jealous co-stars, or private conversations leaked to the tabloids just to ruin reputations. "It's not competition," Newman once said of them. "It's cannibalism." Then came the addict. Not always to substances, sometimes to power, attention, or validation. These actors lived for applause, unable to exist without it. Newman felt sympathy for them, but also sadness. He believed that this addiction turned many good people into destructive ones, because they could never feel satisfied, no matter how much fame they had. And finally, there was the ghost. These were the ones who had everything: talent, money, love, and yet had lost themselves so completely that they were barely alive inside. Newman described them as empty rooms with the lights still on. He said this was the fate that terrified him the most, and the one he fought hardest to avoid. To Newman, these 6 faces of darkness weren't just about others. They were warnings to himself. Hollywood, he knew, had a way of consuming even the best of people. He refused to become a charmer or a tyrant. He fought to stay humble, to keep his marriage with Joanne Woodward strong. to pour his energy into his craft and his philanthropy instead of his ego. Friends who heard him talk about these archetypes say it wasn't gossip. It was reflection. Newman wasn't judging individuals. He was studying human nature through the lens of fame. The camera, he once said, doesn't just show faces, it shows souls. And some of them are very hard to look at. As his career continued, Newman surrounded himself only with people who passed what he called the quiet test. Those who treated waiters, makeup artists, and extras with the same respect they gave producers and critics. These were the ones he trusted. Everyone else he kept at arm's length. By identifying these 6 archetypes, Newman didn't just protect himself, he defined his moral code. He believed that knowing what kind of darkness lived around you was the only way to make sure it never lived inside you. And in doing so, he became something rare in Hollywood, a man who could look in the mirror and still recognize the person staring back. By the time Paul Newman reached the later years of his life, he had become something far greater than a movie star. He was a symbol of dignity, of discipline, of a kind of moral strength Hollywood rarely produced. People admired him not only because he was talented, but because he refused to let fame change who he was at his core. Yet behind the calm smile and gentle humor, Newman carried decades of experience. Lessons learned from witnessing how fame shaped, sharpened, and sometimes shattered the people around him. He never publicly revealed the 6 types he talked about in private, but the impact of those reflections was unmistakable in everything he did. Newman believed that the real test of character wasn't how you acted when the spotlight was on, but when no one was watching. And he had seen enough in Hollywood's golden age to know that many of its brightest stars failed that test. In interviews from his later years, Newman often spoke about the weight of fame. He said that stardom acted like a mirror, but a warped one. It showed you only what people adored, not who you really were. And unless you had strong values, that mirror could consume you. Fame exaggerates everything, he once said. It turns a crack into a canyon. He'd seen good people turn into tyrants, kind people become manipulators, and brilliant artists lose themselves entirely. Yet Newman never spoke with bitterness. If anything, he sounded like a man who had made peace with the complexities of a world he had once entered with innocence. Age brought clarity. The older he became, the more he recognized what truly mattered. He dedicated more of his energy to philanthropy, starting Newman's Own, a food company that donated 100% of its profits to charity, raising hundreds of millions of dollars. He built camps for children with serious illnesses, supported civil rights causes, and quietly donated to individuals in need. It was his way of pushing back against the darkness he had witnessed, proving that Hollywood didn't have to hollow out the people who lived in it. Instead, he showed that fame could be used as a tool for compassion rather than control. To friends who spent time with Newman in his later years said he loved to reminisce about the actors who inspired him, the ones who stayed, humble despite success. But when he spoke about the darker personalities he'd encountered, he didn't name them, even then. He believed that exposing individuals wasn't the point. Exposing patterns was, people change, he said. But the industry doesn't. It just produces new versions of the same characters. He hoped younger actors would pay attention. He hoped they'd understand that the true danger of Hollywood wasn't scandal or failure. It was losing yourself. Newman often warned them, you don't protect your soul by accident. You protect it on purpose. He encouraged them to stay close to family, hold real friendships tight, and keep something sacred outside the industry. A passion, a cause, a belief. As his health declined and he stepped away from acting, Newman became reflective, almost philosophical. He spent more time cooking, racing cars, gardening, and enjoying quiet evenings with Joanne Woodward, the love of his life. Their marriage, unusually stable for Hollywood, became the clearest example of how Newman refused to let fame devour him. It was his anchor, the force that kept him grounded when the world around him tried desperately to lift him off the ground. In his final interviews, Newman expressed a calm acceptance of his life. He admitted he wasn't perfect, but he was proud that he had navigated fame without losing his humanity. And in a rare moment of candid wisdom, he summed up everything he had learned from the glamorous and the grotesque sides of Hollywood. Talent is a gift. Fame is a curse. Character is a choice. Those words are now part of his legacy. A reminder that even in an industry built on illusion, one man can choose to live by truth. In the end, Paul Newman didn't just survive Hollywood's golden age. He transcended it. And perhaps that is why, decades after his debut, he remains one of the few stars whose light hasn't dimmed. He understood what others didn't, that greatness isn't measured by applause, but by the person you become when the applause fades.